between Aram and Israel. In the 3rd year, Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, came down to the king of Israel. Now the king of Israel said to his servants, do you know that Aram and Israel, in the 3rd year, Jehoshaphat, what happened? The king of Judah came down to the king of Israel. Now the king of Israel said to his servants, do you know that Aram and Israel, in the 3rd year, Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, came down to the king of Israel? Yeah. I don't know what's happened there. But, okay. I'll just turn it down all the way. I guess it's still going.
Up here, it looks like everything is running, and I had this little thing that says go live, but I need to pick it. And so went online to see if I could hear it, but I couldn't hear it. So I hit go live, and it must have just turned it on.
Okay. Okay, it's working. So I don't know if everybody that was watching on YouTube heard that whole first part. If you didn't, sorry. If you were here, you would have. So 1 Kings chapter 22, I think I was at verse 3, talking about how the kingdom of Aram has been challenging the sovereignty of Israel. It says there in the middle of the verse, do you know that Ramoth Gilead belongs to us? And we are still doing nothing to take it out of the hand of the king of Aram. So they're going to go up and they're going to fight again the king of Aram. And this is, of course, where Micaiah, the prophet, says, you're not going to win. You're not going to win against the Arameans. And Ahab, eventually, he gets killed in all this. Now, if we go to 2 Kings chapter 6, and that's jumping ahead a little bit, but we're still in the context of Elijah and Elisha. This is Elisha's ministry. And in chapter 6, what's happening here is that in verse 8, the Arameans are going to go up and fight Israel. All right? And the Israelites are finding out their plans before they get a chance to do anything. And so they want to go after Elisha. We'll get to that. But my point is, we see the Arameans are coming to fight against Israel again. And then in verse 24, it says, this is chapter 6 of 2 Kings, verse 24. Now it came about after this that Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, gathered all his army and went up and besieged Samaria. So here's, again, this is another occasion. So there's at least 5 times when we talk about the ministry of Elijah and Elisha, and there's probably more than that, but these are the 5 that I picked out, where we see that the Arameans, the kingdom of Aram, is challenging the sovereignty of Israel. And so if we go back to our passage in chapter 5, 2 Kings chapter 5, we see here that the Arameans have a controlling influence over Israel. A controlling influence. We will find in here that Naaman had previously raided into Israel and took captives. Okay? You don't do that unless you can exert some power and influence. We see that the political setting between Israel and the kingdom of Aram is such that neither is powerful enough just to out and out conquer the other. So they're always picking at each other, but it does seem that the Arameans have an edge over the Israelites. And we see this edge over the Israelites because Ben-Hadad, the king of Aram, is able to write a letter to King Jehoram, and when Jehoram gets that letter, he goes to pieces. He gets really upset because he thinks a fight's being picked with him. We'll see that. But you want to understand the political setting here between Israel and the kingdom of Aram. Aram has a slight edge, power edge on Israel. So let's look at verse 1 here real quick to learn about Naaman. It says, "Now Naaman, captain of the army of the king of Aram, was a great man with his master and highly respected because by him the Lord had given victory to Aram." Don't just skip over that. The Lord by Naaman had given victory to Aram. The man was also a valiant warrior, a leper. So look at the status of Naaman. He was a captain. This is the commander. This is the chief of the army of Aram. He was respected by his king because he defeated Israel. Now the Lord provided that victory. That's what we see here in verse 1. But we see that he is the one who's involved in leading the troops to victory over Israel. And we also see that he was a warrior. He was a warrior, much like David was a warrior, and Jehoshaphat was a warrior. So we have already heard how Jehoshaphat was a mighty man and a warrior. We see that in 2 Chronicles with the record there. Let me go back. So that's the status of Naaman, but we also see Naaman was afflicted. He was a leper. The word leper here and the related word leprosy that we're going to see in verse 3. So if you look at the bottom of verse 3, you see the word leprosy. These are not technical terms for what we know today as leprosy, okay? These were terms that could be used for any number of skin diseases that had much of the same characteristics as leprosy might today, such as patches of flesh, raw flesh. It would cause people's hair to turn white. And when you look at the Bible, there were varying degrees of severity of what is labeled as leprosy here. And we also want to note that the Arameans had a different view of leprosy than the Israelites. Now, if you were an Israelite and you had leprosy, how were you treated? Outcast. Could you go to the temple? No. Matter of fact, the only way your temple privileges could be restored is if the priest said, "Hey, you're cleansed." But you could not go into the temple because you're unclean. You're unclean. Here we see that Naaman was a leper, but he was cheek to cheek with the king, so to speak. So the Arameans did not view people with leprosy the same way the Israelites viewed. That's going to be important here a little bit later, so keep that in the back of your head. So the king of Aram here in verse 1, this is Ben-Hadad. Ben-Hadad just means the son of Hadad. Okay, so this is the Hadadian dynasty, so to speak. And there's a number of Ben-Hadads that are found in the Bible. This is Ben-Hadad number 1, Ben-Hadad the first, so to speak. Now, we see here in the account of Naaman in verses 2 and 3 that we're introduced to this little Israelite slave girl. It says in verse 2, "Now the Arameans had gone out in bands and had taken captive a little girl from the land of Israel, and she waited on Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, 'I wish that my master were with the prophet who is in Samaria. Then he would cure him of his leprosy.'" So here's this gal who was taken captive on one of these Aramean raids into Israel. And somewhere along the way, she becomes the servant of the wife of Naaman. And consider her attitude here and her outlook on life. She's a slave. She is an Israelite, not an Aramean. And she's working for this Aramean woman whose husband is in charge of the army that took her captive. And she doesn't have any ill will towards him. In fact, she says she's really, it's almost a fondness that you see here and a care and concern for him, because she says, you know what? If he could go down to this prophet, he would heal him. He would heal him. And so in verse 4, we see that Naaman has a hope of healing. It says, Naaman went in and told his master, saying, thus and thus spoke the girl who was from the land of Israel. So he told him the same thing that the little Israelite girl had told him. So there's a possibility. Even though he heard this from a little slave girl, he's saying there is a hope that I could be healed from this leprosy. And so in verse 4, we need to understand this as Naaman is not really just passing on information to the king. He's asking the king a question. And the question is, can I go find this guy? So that's really what's happening there. And so we come to verses 5 through 6, and we see Naaman is sent to Israel by the king. It says in verse 5, then the king of Aram said, go now, and I'll send a letter to the king of Israel. So he says, go, and you know what? I'm even going to write a letter to the king of Israel to sort of smooth things over so you can get taken care of. It says he departed and took with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothes. Now, according to my calculation, based on the value of these things from about last week, this is going to be roughly $4,418,115. Okay? So the silver is worth almost $100,000. The gold, it's about 150 pounds of gold we're talking about here. It's worth 4.2, almost $4.3 million, and 10 suits of clothes. And keep in mind, this is not J.C. Penney's suit, okay? This isn't off the rack. These would have been what we would consider custom-made clothes, from the best tailors in New York City or something like that. So, and a custom suit like that, I actually looked up how much a custom suit would cost. And the mean of custom suits is going to be about $8,000. So that's a lot of money. That's a lot of money. And Naaman's got all this stuff. He packs it up and he's taking it with him. Okay? Verse 6. He brought the letter to the king of Israel, saying, and now as this letter comes to you, behold, I have sent Naaman, my servant. So this is what the letter says. This is the contents of the letter. I have sent Naaman, my servant. So Benhadad's writing to Jehoram. I've sent Naaman, my servant, to you, that you may cure him of his leprosy. So how would you like it for your bank to say, you're trying to pay your house off, and the bank president writes you a letter and says, by the way, as a part of your obligation, paying this mortgage off, you need to cure my friend of leprosy. It's a pretty incredible request that he is asking there. And of course, this sends the king of Israel into a tizzy. Verse 7. Tizzy is a technical word. It says, when the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes, a sign of distress and anguish. He tore his clothes and said, am I God to kill and to make alive? So what he's saying here is, this is something that only God can do. I can't do this. That this man is sending word to me to cure a man of leprosy. Now here's what he's thinking this letter's about at the end of verse 7. But consider now and see how he is seeking a quarrel against me. So Jehoram picks this letter up and reads it, and he says, Ben-Hadad is picking a fight with me. He's trying to make an excuse to invade us again. That's what he's trying to do. Jehoram's worried about that because he knows Ben-Hadad is more powerful than he is. Okay, so Jehoram doesn't want to fight Ben-Hadad. He doesn't have the means to do it. And so he's upset. Obviously, he would be upset. Now, in verse 8, we see the comfort of Elisha. It says it happened when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, that he was upset, that he sent word to the king saying, why have you torn your clothes? Now let him come to me, and he shall know there is a prophet in Israel. Now keep that phrase in mind. He shall know that there is a prophet in Israel. So Elisha says to Jehoram, hey, just send him, when he comes, send him down to me, and he's going to understand. There's a prophet in Israel. And so in verses 9 through 14, we have Naaman coming to Elisha. So verse 9. So Naaman came with his horses and his chariots, notice plural and plural. So this is a big entourage. And stood at the doorway of the house of Elisha. So here comes Naaman, what do you call him? The head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And he shows up with his entourage, and he's standing at Elisha's front door. Now let's see what Elisha does. Verse 10. Elisha sent a messenger to him. He doesn't even go to the door. He doesn't even answer the door. He sends a messenger to him. And this is the message that's given to Naaman. Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh will be restored to you, and you will be clean. So Elisha doesn't even speak to the man. The man comes all the way from Damascus, big entourage, horses and chariots, stands at the front door for Elisha. He doesn't even get out of his lazy boy. He just says to his servant, go tell Naaman this. And so that happens. And so we see Naaman's reaction to this starting in verse 11. But Naaman was furious and went away. So he storms away and said, behold, I thought he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God and wave his hands all over the place and cure the leper. So here's what Naaman's expecting. He's expecting Elisha to act like the prophets of Baal. That's what he's expecting, that he would come out and he would make a big show of curing him of his leprosy. And if you want to know exactly what that would look like, just watch Benny Hinn. Because that would be exactly the big show, you know, making a big deal, big shouting and all that, and then waving his hands, hocus pocus type stuff, you know, abracadabra, waving his wand, and Naaman would be cured. This is what Naaman is expecting. Well, of course, he didn't get what he was expecting. And so there's that part of the expectation that Elisha didn't even come out and do anything. And then he complains. He complains here in verse 12. He says, are not Abana and far the rivers of Damascus better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean? So he turned and went away in a rage. So he's saying there, look, the Jordan's a dirty river. The rivers in Damascus are much better, much cleaner. If it's just a matter of getting in water and washing, couldn't I have just done that at home? So he's saying this little man's ridiculous, and what he's asking me to do is ridiculous. And so he's upset and he goes away. But notice here the wisdom of his servants. Look at verse 13. Then his servants came near and spoke to him and said, "My father, had the prophet told you to do something great, would you not have done it?" So the servants say, look, if Elisha had asked you to do something difficult, you would have done it to be healed, wouldn't you have? How much more then, it says here in verse 13, how much more then when he says to you, wash and be clean? In other words, the servant is saying, why don't you just do what he says? You've come all this way. You're prepared to give him a fortune, $5 million. You're prepared to give him a fortune and do whatever it takes to be clean. Why don't you just do what the man says? And so verse 14, we see that he does. So he went down and dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. So he goes down 7 times, like he said. He's obedient, does exactly what he's told to do now, and he is healed. And so after he's healed, what we see happen is that he wants to give gifts to Elisha. He brought all these things. He wants to give them to Elisha, and Elisha says, no. And so let's look at this. Verses 15 through 16, Elisha is going to refuse the gifts. It says, when he returned to the man of God, when Naaman returned to Elisha with all his company and came and stood before him, he said, behold, now I know. Now remember what he said over in verse 8. What Elisha said in verse 8. Elisha said in verse 8. He says, send Naaman to me so he knows there's a prophet in Israel. Now look what Naaman says. He says, I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel. Put that another way, there's only one God. It's the God of Israel. That's what he's saying. So Elisha says, and I'm not picking on Elisha here, because I think he said, the intent of what he said in verse 8 is, let him come to me and he will know there is a prophet of God in Israel. And when Naaman is healed, he says, I know there's only one God. I know there's only one God. And he says, so please take the present from your servant now. But he, that is Elisha, said, as the Lord lives, before whom I stand, I will take nothing. And he, Naaman, urged him to take it, but he, Elisha, refused. So they went back and forth. And Naaman was like, just take it. I'm thankful to you, thankful to the Lord. Just take the gifts. And Elisha said, no. Can't take it. Think back to the Shunamite woman. When she provides food and a place for Elisha to stay. And he says, what can we do for this woman? The woman says, nothing. You don't need to do anything for me. I got everything I need. I'm not doing this to get anything. So Elisha has that same response to Naaman. Now, in verses 17 through 19, I want us to see that Naaman is converted. Naaman's converted. Look what it says, verse 17 through 19. Naaman said, if not, please let your servant at least be given 2 mule loads of earth. Now, isn't that interesting? Why do you think that's significant? I think he realizes the very dirt of the land of Israel is important to God. The very earth. Goes on and says, "For your servant will no longer offer burnt offerings, nor will he sacrifice to other gods, but to Yahweh." So this is Naaman's conversion. He says, there's only one God, the God of Israel, and I will no longer worship any of these other false gods. I will only worship the one true and living God, Yahweh. And then he has this request in verse 18. Notice after his conversion, his spiritual sensitivity. It says, "In this matter, may the Lord pardon your servant." So he's going to bring up something. He's saying ahead of time, he's asking for forgiveness ahead of time. He says, "When my master," so that's the master is Ben-Hadad, king of Aram. "When my master goes into the house of Remnon," false god, "to worship there, and he leans on my hand." In other words, when the king goes in to worship, I have to go with him. It is my responsibility. It is my job to be with the king. So when he leans on my hand and I bow myself in the house of Remnon, when I bow myself in the house of Remnon, the Lord pardon your servant in this matter. So he's saying to Elisha, I have certain responsibilities that will take me into the place where they worship these false gods. I'm not worshiping these false gods anymore, but I have to go in there. I'm seeking the Lord's forgiveness now. And look what Elisha says in verse 19. He said to him, "Go in peace." No problem. No problem. The Lord knows your heart. The Lord knows you love him and now you're worshiping him. Go in peace. No problem. So we have Naaman's conversion here. Notice he's immediately spiritually sensitive. He knows this is an issue to go into these other false and be engaged in the false worship of other gods. He knows that's a good thing. So for Christians, I think one of the things we need to recognize is when someone gets saved, there needs to be an immediate sensitivity to sin. To sin. There should be an immediate sensitivity to sin. As we come to verses 20 through 27, we have sort of the problem here that comes up with Gehazi. And we're going to see Gehazi's greed. We're going to see Gehazi lie, his deception, and then we're going to see his punishment here. So it says in verse 20, "But Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, the man of God, thought to himself," is the idea, "Behold, my master has spared this Naaman the Aramean by not receiving from his hands what he brought. As the Lord lives, I will run after him and take something from him." Gehazi does not have a spirit of mercy and grace, does he? Because he says, look, Elisha should have made him pay. Should have made him pay for this miracle. He deserves to make him, not that Elisha deserves anything, but Naaman deserves to have to pay for this miracle. So you see that attitude with Gehazi. And so Gehazi says, this is happening in his heart. He says, I'm going to go after him. I'm going to tell him. Cough something up, right? So here's what he does, verse 21. "So Gehazi pursues Naaman. When Naaman saw one running after him, he came down from the chariot to meet him and said, 'Is all well?' It's like, shalom, question mark. Verse 22, he said, 'All is well, shalom.' Gehazi said this. Then he goes on to say, here's a lie. 'My master has sent me, saying, Behold, Just now 2 young men of the sons of the prophets have come to me from the hill country of Ephraim. Please give them a talent of silver and 2 changes of clothes. So there's the lie. Well, actually, there's several lies in there. My master sent me. That's a lie. And then he lied about these 2 guys, these 2 prophets. Verse 23. Naaman said, "Be pleased to take 2 talents." And he urged him, and he bound 2 talents of silver in 2 bags with 2 changes of clothes and gave them to 2 of his servants, and they carried them before him. So Gehazi had his servants with him, and they gave him the stuff to carry. Now notice the deception here. In verse 24, the deception. When he came to the hill, he took them from their hand, the hand of the servants, and deposited them in the house, and sent the men away, and they departed. But he went in and stood before his master, like nothing happened. So there's the deception. I'm going to hide this stuff in the house. Now, what's that sound like? Getting something you don't have and hiding it in your house. Achan? Sounds like Achan, doesn't it? Okay. Now we see Gehazi's punishment. Elisha said to him, "Where have you been, Gehazi?" This is almost like a parent talking to a child. "Where have you been, Gehazi?" And what does Gehazi say? "Nowhere." He sees him come in the door, probably all sweaty from trying to hide that money and clothes. "Where have you been, Gehazi?" "Nowhere." "Who were you with?" "No one." "What have you been doing?" "Nothing." So he says, "Nowhere." Now look at verse 26. Then he said, that's Elisha said to him, "Did not my heart go with you when the man turned from his chariot to meet you?" Tells him exactly what happened. "Is it a time to receive money and to receive clothes and olive groves and vineyards and sheep and oxen and male and female servants?" So are we supposed to be taking money from people? Is that what we do? Is that what these miraculous things are about? Is to get us money, to earn us money from people? Of course not. Verse 27. "Therefore, the leprosy of Naaman shall cling to you and your descendants forever." So he went out from his presence a leper as white as snow. So here in this account, we have a man who was probably in line to be the next prophet of Israel. Just like Elisha was in line after Elijah, and Elisha was Elijah's servant. Gehazi is Elijah's servant. And so he's probably the guy who's next in line to be the prophet after Elisha is off the scene. Had the same position as Elisha had with Elijah. But we find he's only mentioned one more time here in the Bible. And that'll be in chapter 8. And we also see in chapter 13, when Elisha dies, he has no successor. There's no one who comes after him. Now, what was Gehazi's problem? Was that? Greed? Covetous? Even having a vengeful spirit? He had several problems. And these things all led him to lie. Even lie, not just to Naaman, but to deceive, or try to deceive, Elisha, his master. But in the end, his sin was seen, his sin was found out, and he had to suffer the consequences. And notice the consequences here were not removal from ministry, because Gehazi is still going to have a ministry. I think we see in chapter 8 that he still continued with Elisha. But the future prospect of his ministry changed in a very negative way. And in all likelihood, his life was shortened because of this disease that he now had, all as a result of this greed, this covetous spirit, and lying. All as a result of that. So this is the ninth miracle, the healing of Naaman. And we see there's more than just his healing as far as the miracle goes. He was converted in this. He turned away from those false gods and he turned to the one true and living God. And I think the reason that he took the dirt, it was significant, but I think he wanted to build a place to worship the one true and living God on the earth of Israel. That's why he took the dirt. It's an important thing. So Naaman, very, very interesting account. We see the positive aspect of Naaman, but we see the very negative aspect of Gehazi. One man we would expect to act like a sinner. The other man we would have expected to act like a saint, but they were reversed, weren't they? Now let's go to the 10th miracle, the floating axe head. The floating axe head, this is in chapter 6, verses 1 through 7. Let me just read down through this real quick, and then I'll make some quick comments. Now the sons of the prophets said to Elisha, "Behold now, the place before you where we are living is too limited for us. We don't have enough room. Please let us go to the Jordan, and each of us take from there a beam, and let us make a place there for ourselves where we may live." So he, Elisha, said, "Go." Then one said, "Please be willing to go with your servants." And he answered, "I shall go." So he went with them, and they came to the Jordan and cut down trees. But as one was felling a beam, the axe head fell into the water, and he cried out and said, "Alas, my master, for it was borrowed." Then the man of God said, "Where did it fall?" And when he showed him the place, he cut off a stick and threw it in there and made the iron float. And he said, "Take it up for yourself." So he put out his hand and took it. So here we're confronted that these accounts, they run on a very similar pattern. There's a problem, there's a solution. Problem and a solution. So here the problem starts out with a minor problem. We don't have enough room for us anymore. We don't have enough room to live. Can we go down to Lowe's and get some lumber? Okay? Can we go down to Lowe's and get some lumber? And Elisha says, okay. And when they go down to get lumber from Lowe's, they had to borrow somebody's truck. And they crashed the truck. Okay? What do they do? So that's kind of what the setting here. So this begins with this problem. They don't have enough space, and so the solution is, let's go get some lumber by the Jordan. There's trees by the Jordan. We'll cut some trees down. We'll build us a couple places to expand. And so as they're taking care of the trees, cutting them down, cutting them up into usable chunks, the head flies off of the axe handle, right? I don't know if you've ever had that happen, but it happens a lot. The head of an axe would just fly off of an axe handle. It just works itself loose. And that's why you never stand in front of somebody cutting wood with an axe. Okay, you don't know if that head's going to stay on there. And it flew into the water. It flew into the Jordan River. Now, I think the first thing I would have done is jumped in the river where I saw the axe head drop and start looking for it. But the guy who was chopping the tree down, he got upset, and he was upset because it was borrowed. So it's not like he was losing his axe. He was losing someone else's axe that he would have had to replace. If it was his axe head, he wouldn't have to replace it. If it's somebody else's axe head, he has to replace it. And notice it specifically says that this axe head is made out of iron at the bottom of verse 6. Now, why is it significant to note that the axe head was made out of iron? Well, yeah, it doesn't float, but bronze doesn't either. But why is iron significant? Iron working was a technology that the Israelites had not mastered. They had to go outside of the land to have other people either buy iron implements or have their axes sharpened or whatever iron implements they had. They had to go outside the land. There weren't, it was metallurgy, blacksmithing, was a little bit like witchcraft. I mean, that's what they thought of it, because you're doing all this crazy stuff and you're producing something that can be used. And those blacksmiths guarded the secrets of their trade, like magicians guard the secrets of their illusions. I mean, they just did not let anybody. So nobody in Israel was really capable of the technology of working iron. So it was borrowed, so it had to be replaced. But the fact that it's iron, it's almost as if it's saying it's irreplaceable. The expense to replace an iron implement would have been incredible. And these guys are not rich, they're prophets. You know, they basically operate on the goodwill of others. We already saw it where a man came down and he had this food, and Elisha said, well, feed it to the boys. That's how they survived. And of course, Elisha takes a stick. Now, what will sticks do that iron won't do? Float. Throws the stick in where it floats to the top. I almost picture like it's supposed to be the handle for the axe head. But it floats up and the man grabs it. So this was a kind of a common miracle. It didn't save anybody's life. It didn't defeat any army. But can you think of another miracle that was kind of a common miracle, solved just a everyday kind of a problem? How about when Jesus turned water into wine at the wedding of Cana? He didn't save anybody's life. The only people who knew what was happening were the disciples. But it solved a problem that they were experiencing right then and there. Same type of miracle, I think. So that's and I'm not keeping up with my stuff here. So that's miracle 10, the floating axe head. Miracle 11 is Elisha's protected from the army of Aram by chariots and horses of fire and blindness. This is in chapter 6, verses 8 through 23. We already talked a little bit about this earlier, about how Aram is challenging the sovereignty of Israel. It starts in verse 8. Now the king of Aram, this is Ben-Hadad, was warring against Israel, and he counseled with his servant, saying, in such place shall be my camp. So they're having a council of war and they're deciding what are they going to do to attack Israel. That's what he's saying here. Verse 9. The man of God, that's Elisha, sent word to the king of Israel saying, beware that you don't go past this place, for the Arameans are coming down there. So Elisha tells the king, this is where they're going to be. This is where they're going to be. Stay away from there. You don't want to just go through there. That's danger. Verse 10. The king of Israel sent out to the place about which the man of God had told him. Thus he warned him so that he guarded himself there more than once or twice. So what that's telling us there is that the king of Israel set up guard posts, outposts to watch this area, and the outposts were 3 times as many as they would normally have put there. Okay, because he was protecting his flank. Now look what happens in the camp of the Arameans, verse 11. Now the heart of the king of Aram was enraged over this. He called his servants and said to them, now here's what he says. will you tell me which one of us is for the king of Israel? So tell me which of us is spying for Israel. That's what the question is. Which one of us is the traitor here? Verse 12, one of his servants said, no, my lord, O king, but Elisha, the prophet who is in Israel, tells the king of Israel the words that you speak in your bedroom. So there are no secrets, is what he's saying. Elisha knows everything you're saying and thinking. You have no secrets from Elisha, and he just tells the king of Israel. And that is how they know what we're doing. Verse 13, so he said, Ben-Hadad said, go and see where he is, that I may send and take him. And it was told him, saying, behold, he's in Dothan. He sent horses and chariots and a great army there, and they came by night and surrounded the city. So Ben-Hadad is going after Elisha. Okay, if Elisha is the one giving the king of Israel all the news, let's just go get Elisha and cut him out of the middle. All right, so he sends a significant group of his army to get him, horses and chariots. Anytime you see horses and chariots, think, I would think a Marine Expeditionary Force, but you want to think like the entire army or an entire section of the army with artillery, tanks, helicopters, planes, everything. They took everything to go after him. The mightiest weapons they had, they took to go after Elisha. Now, verse 15. So Elisha's all tucked into his house there and everything. And here these guys come. It says, when the attendant of the man of God had risen early and gone out, behold, an army with horses and chariots were circling the city. And his master said to him, and his servant said to him, alas, my master, what shall we do? So the servant gets up. We're not told who this servant is. It could be Gehazi. Not told who it is. He looks out, and there's horses and chariots all around. And we're surrounded. What are we going to do? Verse 16. So he answered, this is Elisha speaking, do not fear, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them. Which, you can imagine what the servant was thinking. Looking around. Probably asked Elisha, you got a mouse in your pocket or something? With us, there's just two of us. And there's more with us than with them. And so, look at verse 17. This is what Elisha does. Then Elisha prayed and said, O Lord, I pray, open his eyes. Now pay attention to this. Open his eyes that he may see. And the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he saw. And behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. Elisha could see all this. His servant could not. And so the Lord opened his eyes. Verse 18. When they, that's the horses and chariots, came down to him, Elisha prayed to the Lord and said, strike this people with blindness, I pray. So he struck them with blindness according to the word of Elisha. So, do you see the play on words that are happening here? Elisha's servant, Elisha prays, open his eyes. Here comes these chariots and horses from Aram. Elisha prays, close their eyes, make them blind. Verse 19, then Elisha said to them, so they're coming down, they can't see anything. So Elisha said, so this is not the way, nor is this the city. Follow me and I will bring you to the man whom you seek. And so it says that he brought them to Samaria. What's Samaria? The capital of Israel. This is where the king's at, this is where the army's at. Verse 20, when they had come to Samaria, Elisha said, O Lord, open the eyes of these men that they may see. So the Lord opened their eyes, and they saw, and behold, they were in the midst of Samaria. They were downtown. They were surrounded. Now, remember, they had Elisha surrounded. Now they are surrounded. Then the king of Israel, when he saw them, said to Elisha, my father, that's just a sign of respect, shall I kill them? Shall I kill them? 2 times he asked. And Elisha answered, You shall not kill them. Would you kill those you've taken captive with your sword and with your bow? Set bread and water before them that they may eat and drink and go to their master. So Elisha says, we're not going to kill these guys. We're going to take care of them. We're going to send them away. And so that's what they did in verse 13. But look at the end of, verse 23. Look at the end of verse 23, though. It says, and the marauding bands of the Arameans did not come again into the land of Israel. So that was the effect. The effect of the kindness of Elisha in not killing these men, or telling Jehoram not to kill them, was that they didn't raid anymore. They didn't come raiding anymore. Well, I think we got about a minute left here. And the next section is actually quite extended. So from chapter 6, verse 24, all the way through chapter 8, verse 6, it's kind of one context, okay? So I want to just, in just the little time that we have, I just want to run over the context of that. There is a famine in the land, and the king of Samaria, of Aram, Ben-Hadad, is laying siege to Samaria. Okay, so it's not just an enemy outside the gates of the city. They're also dealing with famine. And as they're dealing with famine, the famine is so bad, it says that you can't hardly even buy a donkey's head. They're so expensive. And dove's dung is expensive. Now, we might say, who in the world is buying bird poop? But remember, in a place like that where there's not a lot of wood, well, let me put it this way. Do you remember reading any stories about as the men were going out across the Great Plains, and first going out across the Great Plains, they needed to start fires. There weren't trees. It was the plains. It was just grass. What did they use? What did they burn? Buffalo chips. You know what buffalo chips are, right? These are dove chips. So same purpose. They would have they would have used these things as fuel for fire. So, but you can't hardly afford it because the famine's so bad and they're under siege. In fact, the famine's so bad, we see examples of cannibalism here, where they are killing their own children and eating them. And of course, this would upset anybody who knew about it or saw it, and it upsets Jehoram to such an extent that he says, Elisha's the guy to blame for this. I'm going to go kill him. He's the guy who's causing all this problem. And when Elisha is confronted with this, he says, by tomorrow, this will all be over. The siege is going to go away, and the famine's going to go away by tomorrow. Just wait. And then you got the story of the 4 lepers there. Remember, they're outside the city. They can't get in the city because the Israelites don't accept lepers. So the lepers say, let's go to the Arameans. They will at least accept us. Maybe they'll give us some food. And they go to the camp, and there's nobody there. Okay? And then, after that, we run into the Shunamite woman again. Because at the beginning of this famine, she had left the land. And now she's coming back. And she needs her land restored. And so this is all part of that account. So that's just a big overview. That's the 12th miracle, the provision of food in the drought. So we still got food in the drought. Then we're going to have the preservation of the Shunamite woman, which isn't a miracle, but nevertheless is part of the context. Then we're going to have the prediction of Hazael being the king of Aram. So Ben-Hadad's the king of Aram right now, and he's going to be replaced. And his replacement was addressed all the way back in 2Kings chapter 19. Chapter 19, verses 15 through 17, when Elijah had his breakdown, and the Lord took him to Mount Horeb and spoke with him. And Elijah kept on giving the same excuse over and over again. And finally the Lord says, okay, I'm going to retire you. I'm pulling you out of the game. And he said, as you go towards your retirement, you are going to anoint 3 people. You're going to anoint Hazael as king of Aram. This is Hazael that we're going to run into next time. You're going to anoint Jehu to be king of Israel. I don't know if we'll run into Jehu next time, but we're getting close to Jehu. And you're also going to anoint Elisha as your replacement. And God's going to use all 3 of those to judge Israel, particularly the house of Ahab. Because whoever Hazael doesn't kill from the house of Ahab, Jehu's going to kill. And whoever Jehu, and by the way, Jehu's the guy who has Jezebel killed. Whoever Jehu doesn't kill, Elisha is supposed to kill. But it's all back there in chapter 19, verses 15 through 17. Okay, that's all the time we have, and we're going to stop, and then I'll see if y'all have any questions or comments about what we did. So let me pray, and then we'll be done, at least our live stream. Father, we give you thanks for this time that we have had together. Thank you for this account of Naaman and how we see that he turned to you, a heart that was stubborn at first, prideful at first, but then was softened, and he turned to you as the one true and living God, the only one to be worshiped. And we're so thankful for that record. And Lord, help us to be aware of those people who are like Naamans in our life, and that we might be able to share the gospel of Jesus Christ with them, and that they would turn to you. We pray this in Christ's name. Amen.